9,498 feet. I'm clinging onto the knife-edge ridge, just near the summit of this mountain that I've been dropped on. One hand clutches the rocky terrain, holding onto the rope that's my only anchor. And as the helicopter flies away, I glance down the sheer face below me, plunging 1,000 feet into a crevasse field below. With my other hand, I hold the climber's hand who's just fallen. And I tell her over the wind, everything will be okay. She's crying mostly from the pain of a badly broken leg, and she has cuts on her forehead and her cheek that drips blood down onto her jacket. She's cold, shaking, and exhausted, barely conscious, but she still manages to tell me what's just happened. How one large stone let loose just above her and knocked her off, and somehow miraculously she had fallen onto the small ledge, not much bigger than my own front door. And I can tell by her drifting wide eyes how hurt and scared she is. The fear of being in such a precarious spot, knowing that her immediate fate only had to do with where she happened to land. And I'm sure we are both silently thinking the same thing. What are the chances? As a doctor, my job is to analyze why things go wrong for people and how to best fix them. So naturally, every time that I work in mountain rescue and I witness these unpredictable big events, I always wonder, how did this person possibly survive? Was there something that they did right when everything seemed to be going wrong? The tricky part about life is that no matter what we have learned in the past, we can never predict the future. And as it turns out, there's a term to describe these unforeseeable and impactful events that seemingly catch us off guard. They've been called black swan events. And just like the bird it's named for, they are rare, but we know that they can and do exist. And that the chances of them happening are never zero. When we look back on them, we often attempt to make sense of their occurrence. We say things like, we should have seen that coming, or next time, we'll do this or that. And then over time, we tend to forget. And whether you realize it or not, everyone here in this room has experienced one. Whether it's a global event, like a stock market crash, a worldwide pandemic, a natural disaster, or a more personal crisis, like an illness, bullying, a job loss, or maybe breaking your leg on top of a mountain. When these events do happen, they are often with hard-to-bear consequences, whether that's for one person, one culture, a country, or for that matter, the entire world. And while this term is typically used in the finance and business world, I'm going to borrow it here because it dawned on me. I'm in the black swan business. I do this every day, and my team does as well, every time that anybody calls us for help. And the good news is that these events can become real opportunities for growth and change, because adversity can be a wonderful teacher. And similarly for everyone in this room, on any of the teams that you are on in your life, by understanding these big events, you can face even bigger obstacles in a much smarter way. As a CEO of a large company, making a new strategic plan, maybe a group project at school where you're facing a tight deadline. Maybe one day you're on the Olympic soccer team, going into a gold medal match, or you're working in a lab full of scientists trying to find a cure for a rare disease. So I'd like to share with you a few of the lessons that I've learned while facing adversity as a doctor through the lens of mountain rescue. Number one is the importance of being prepared. When we prepare ourselves individually, we are actually preparing ourselves as a team. because we are only ever as strong as each other. We repeat our training so that hard things become easy and easy things become routine, maybe even boring. So that when we are put into difficult situations, like darkness or a blizzard, we don't have to spend time thinking about how to get our job done. We do it naturally, and all of us do it to the same reliable degree. What I like to call independently dependable. And that makes everything a whole lot easier on ourselves when we are under pressure. In this case, we searched for the injured climber, and we planned our mission according to what we knew and what we saw. We set up and discussed with precision what we were going to do step by step. I attached myself to the line under the helicopter, and the pilot took me back up to the patient. And there, I did what I medically needed to do. In this case, it was to splint a broken leg. Sometimes I might do CPR. The pilot brings the line back to me, I attach us back on, and away we fly. Now, in reality, it's not quite that simple, but I assure you it is just like muscle memory. We could do this in our sleep, simply by the sheer number of times that we train, practice, and perform these rescues. Challenges of this magnitude also emphasize the significance of being adaptable. When a hiker went off route while scrambling a well-known path to the top of a peak, what sounded like an easy rescue very quickly turned into a complex one. And you'll see why. Once they became stuck 600 feet up from the side of an overhanging cliff, 300 feet from the top, they realized they couldn't go up or down. We received a 911 phone call from them saying they couldn't hang on much longer. If any of you have ever watched Sylvester Stallone in that early 90s movie, Cliffhanger, well, this was that moment. And the rescue, to us, seemed impossible for several reasons. The helicopter couldn't get close enough to the cliff where they were, and the sheer vertical distance and the non-stop rockfall made it far too dangerous for us to rappel from the top or climb up from below. It took multiple rescue teams to say, no, not possible. Until one person said, what if? What if we put multiple long lines together safely in series under the helicopter to a length we've never used before? What if we sent a stranded hiker a video explaining what we would do and what our technical sequences would be to stay safe, knowing that we would only have a transient moment to perform this rescue, and that we risk them falling should they do anything that we didn't expect? And what if we put the absolute best of ourselves and our team together, and together we boldly tried and agreed, sadly, we may need to fail in saving the hiker for the greater good and safety of all. Well, guess what? It worked. When there seemed to be no viable options, and we thought we faced a horrible end to the story, we innovated and we adapted in order to accomplish a very, very difficult task. Of course, we can't talk about times like these without also highlighting the power of collaboration within a team. And for me, there is always one rescue like no other that made this stunningly clear. First, I'm going to ask a question. Raise your hand if it's a simple question. Who here has ever been in an airplane? Vast majority of us. Now, how many of you have ever thought, even for a split second, what would happen in the very unlikely event that this airplane crashed? Few less. Oh, sometimes we wonder. Now think, how would you face that moment? What would you do? Now, I've never been in an airplane crash, but let me tell you about the time I went to one. After a Mayday call had made its way back to our dispatch, we knew 5 passengers and a pilot had crashed into a mountainside in a very remote area, nearly an hour's flight time away from us. All we knew was that people were hurt and the pilot was unconscious and in critical condition. And as you can imagine, a lot goes through your mind when you have an hour to think about what's going to happen at an airplane crash when you get there. Will we find them? What exactly will we find? Well, when we arrived at the crash site, I remember thinking for a split second that it was like a movie set because of the unreal appearance of what we saw. As much as I have trained for emergencies, I've never been the only doctor for such a disaster. I had never felt so alone. The helicopter hovered, and I jumped out with my bag and I ran towards the survivors over the mangled metal and debris that was scattered everywhere. And I could hear the constant beeping, beep, 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 of the emergency ELT beacon, as if the airplane had its own pulse. For half an hour, I raced to assess, prioritize, and manage all those 6 patients, while the clouds had descended and made it impossible for anyone else to arrive to help. And I recall during one distinct moment, listening through my stethoscope for breath sounds on the chest of the pilot. And while at the same time I could hear the sounds of aircraft from the Coast Guard, the military, and 2 air ambulances circling overhead, unseen, unhurt, and unable to land. And that was perhaps the longest 30 minutes of my medical career. I counted each second as they went, because I felt outnumbered, outpaced, and overwhelmed by everything that was happening all around me. So you can imagine my relief when the weather improved and the clouds finally began to lift. And one by one, I heard the voices of fellow rescuers coming in behind me, each one of them like a lifeline. And like a machine, there was a synchronicity that fell into place. One of the rescuers dealt with a patient over here. And over there, there was one that dealt with our radio calls, and yet another was organizing gear and arranging transport for our patients to hospital. And these kinds of systems, whether within a team or multiple teams working together, are all about seamless coordination. Each member contributes their unique skills and expertise. And for us, it meant everyone getting off the mountain that day alive. Thanks in full to teamwork. Which brings me to my last point. Life is going to test you. It's going to test you in big ways, and it's going to test you in small ways. Mountain rescue has certainly tested me as a doctor, but adversity has truly also taught me so much about life in general, and I consider it a privilege to be there in a moment when someone needs me. Still, there's one key lesson that I have yet to mention. One thing that is perhaps the most important lesson of all. And this one doesn't come from me or my experience or the experience of my team. This one comes from those that we rescued and what they learned when they were tested. A young man, a visiting skier from another country, followed some ski tracks outside of the local ski resort boundary. He was alone, dressed pretty lightly, and he was critically unfamiliar with the terrain. But he saw those tracks disappearing out of bounds in that magical, untouched powder and decided it was just too hard to pass up. And to be honest, I would have made the same choice. What he didn't realize was that there was a last mandatory turn that he would need to make to return safely back into bounds. Instead, he continued skiing down an ever-steepening and treacherous ravine, further and further down in deep snow until he was unable to go back up. And once he was past an icy waterfall, he knew he was at the point of no return. In front of him was nothing but snowy, cold, white, harsh wilderness. And now there was simply no escape. As these stories go, he makes one phone call to his friend back home, and he only manages to get in, "I'm lost," before the cell phone cut off and died. That night, a heavy blizzard sets in, and temperatures plummeted to minus 20 degrees. 2.5 feet of new snow fell. Ski patrol, search teams, and avalanche dogs all set out. With any short breaks in the storm, our rescue helicopters would comb the area where he was last seen. But there was no sign of him. No trace. Besides, he was dressed in black, so it would be nearly impossible to see him from the air, appearing like any of the trees and blending into the rocks, the bushes, and the forest that protruded from that deep snow. Everyone agreed he couldn't survive the now 3 days of Arctic conditions. And yet, on one last pass by our heli search team, the pilot noticed a flicker of movement just out of the corner of his eye. Something at the bottom of an avalanche chute, and it was enough to make him go around for just one more look. When the helicopter approached, the man, half unconscious, cold, and ready to give up, had surrendered the last of his energy to raise his arm, to shake a few skinny branches on a thin alder bush where he laid half buried in the snow, absolutely near his physical limits. Despite the fear that the young man had felt trying to survive for those 3 days, he'd focused on his persistent will to live. It was such a deep perseverance he had that allowed him to make one final push to survive. This is what resilience looks like. It is the greatest gift that you can give yourself and to those around you and on any team in your life, be it friends or family, anyone. It is what makes you get through something and keep going, even though it is so hard that you want to give up, but you don't. Being prepared, being adaptable, working cohesively together with others to collaborate, and developing your grit, your resilience. Use these tools next time you're being tested by life, and I promise you, you will always find your way. Thank you.